She was 3 years old. That matters. Because at that age, curiosity comes before fear, before memory, before understanding what can hurt you. The house was quiet in that way only empty houses are. Not peaceful, just still. No voices, no footsteps, no one telling her, "Don't touch that." The stove was on, one burner forgotten. A small orange glow, a pot warming slowly, doing exactly what fire always does when no one is watching. She stood there, small feet on the cold kitchen floor, staring at it. Not scared, not hesitant, interested. Her hand lifted slow and careful, the way children move when they're learning what the world does back when you touch it. And there was no one there to stop her. Her mother wasn't in the house, wasn't in the hallway, wasn't about to call her name from another room. Her mother had already gone. And yet, something happened next that shouldn't have. Before we go any further, if stories like this pull you in, quiet moments, real danger, and the small details that change everything, take a second to subscribe and leave a like. It helps more than you think, and it keeps these stories coming. The girl leaned closer to the stove. The pot gave a soft sound. Not loud, just enough to be noticed if you were paying attention. Steam gathered beneath the lid, faint, almost invisible. Her fingers hovered near the control knob. It was warm, not hot yet, just warm enough to invite a touch. In another version of this moment, the one everyone assumes, a scream would come next, or a crash, or the sharp sound of something falling. But that's not what happened. Instead, the girl froze. Not because she was told to, not because someone grabbed her arm. She simply stopped. Her hand hung there, unmoving, as if something inside her had decided for her that this was as far as she would go. She tilted her head, confused. Children don't question instincts, they obey them. She stepped back, just one step. Behind her, the chair scraped softly against the floor. A small sound, normal, nothing dramatic, but that sound was enough. The pot wobbled. Not enough to fall, just enough to make the lid shift. Steam escaped all at once. The heat rushed upward. If she had still been there, if her hand had been just a few inches closer, it would have been different. Very different. She watched the steam with wide eyes. Then, like children do, her attention moved on. She turned away from the stove and wandered toward the living room, already forgetting what had almost happened. Minutes later, the front door opened. A neighbor. She wasn't supposed to have a key, but she did. She had been checking in since the mother was gone. Not every day, not at the same time. Just when something nudged her too. She smelled it the moment she stepped inside. Heat, metal, something not right. The stove was turned off seconds later. The pot removed. The danger gone. The neighbor stood there, heart pounding, imagining what could have happened if she'd arrived a little later. The girl sat on the couch, swinging her legs, calm, safe. When asked why she'd gone into the kitchen, the girl shrugged. When asked why she didn't touch the stove, she frowned, thinking hard. "I don't know," she said. Then, after a pause, she added something no one expected. "Mom wouldn't like that." The neighbor felt her chest tighten. "Mom?" she asked gently. The girl nodded, as if it were obvious. "She told me to stop." No explanation followed, no description of a voice, no mention of seeing anyone. Just that simple statement, as if stopping had been the most natural thing in the world, as if protection had come from somewhere so familiar it didn't need words. The neighbor didn't press further. Some questions aren't meant to be answered. That night, after the girl was asleep, the neighbor stood alone in the kitchen. She looked at the stove, at the knobs, at the place where small fingers had almost touched something unforgiving. She whispered a quiet thank you to no one in. particular, and left the light on, not because she was afraid, but because some instincts don't come from fear. They come from love. And sometimes love doesn't leave when people do. The neighbor didn't sleep well that night. She kept replaying the image in her mind, the small girl standing in front of the stove, fingers so close to danger that a single breath could have changed everything. What stayed with her wasn't the heat, or the pot, or even the thought of what could have happened. It was the way the girl had said it. Mom wouldn't like that. Not confused, not scared, certain. The next morning, the girl woke up early. She always did. Her routine hadn't changed much since her mother was gone, at least not on the surface. She still ate cereal from the same blue bowl, still lined up her stuffed animals on the couch, still sat by the window in the afternoons watching cars pass like they were going somewhere important. But small things were different. Things only someone paying attention would notice. She talked less. She listened more. And sometimes she paused in the middle of doing nothing at all, like she was waiting for something invisible to finish speaking. The neighbor noticed this over the next few days. She came by often, more often than before, always with a reason she could explain to herself, checking the locks, bringing food, returning a container she didn't remember borrowing. The girl seemed comfortable with her presence, but not dependent on it. She didn't cling, didn't ask questions, didn't ask where her mother was. Children grieve differently. Sometimes they don't cry. They just adjust. One afternoon, the neighbor was helping her draw at the kitchen table. Crayons scattered everywhere. Paper covered in uneven circles and stick figures. "Who's that?" the neighbor asked, pointing at a figure drawn larger than the rest. The girl glanced at it. "That's Mom." The neighbor smiled gently. "She looks tall." The girl shook her head. "She's far. Far. Not gone. Not lost. Just far." Later that same day, the neighbor stepped into the bathroom to grab a towel. She heard a sound from the kitchen, not a crash, not a scream, a click. She froze. Then she moved fast. The stove. Again. She rushed back into the kitchen, heart already racing ahead of her. The girl stood there looking up at the control panel, but this time, the knob was already turned back. Off. The pot sat cold. No heat, no steam. Nothing. The neighbor looked around, confused. "You didn't touch it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The girl shook her head. "It was like that when I came in." The neighbor stared at the stove. She knew she had turned it off earlier. She was sure of it. But she also knew she hadn't been in the kitchen in the last 10 minutes. She crouched down next to the girl. "Did someone come in here with you?" she asked. The girl frowned, thinking. Then she nodded. "Mom did." The neighbor felt the air leave her lungs. She swallowed. "She told you to turn it off?" The girl shook her head again. She already did. That night, the neighbor went home uneasy. She wasn't scared. Fear wasn't the right word. It felt more like standing on the edge of something you didn't understand, knowing that stepping back wouldn't make it disappear. She called the girl's aunt, asked if anyone else had been stopping by the house. No one had. Locks hadn't been changed, no signs of anyone coming or going. Everything was exactly as it should have been, except for the timing. A few days later, something else happened. The girl was playing outside in the small yard behind the house. The gate that separated the yard from the alley was old. It didn't always latch properly. The neighbor was inside, folding laundry near the window. She glanced up just in time to see the gate swing open. The girl looked at it. She started walking toward it. The alley beyond was quiet, but that didn't mean safe. The neighbor dropped the laundry and ran for the door. But before she reached it, the girl stopped, mid-step. She turned around and walked back toward the house. The gate swung shut behind her. The neighbor stood there, breathless. When she asked why the girl had come back inside, the answer was simple. Mom said not to go there. That night, the neighbor sat alone, trying to reason her way out of what she was seeing. She listed explanations: habit, memory, imagination. Children repeat things they've heard before. They create voices to fill quiet spaces. But none of that explained the timing, or the consistency, or the way danger seemed to step aside just before the girl reached it. The neighbor found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She talked to the mother, not out loud, not formally, just in her thoughts. If you're still here, she thought, you're doing a good job. The house remained quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt watched, not in a threatening way, in the way someone watches a sleeping child, counting breaths without being seen. The neighbor realized then that the girl wasn't being protected in dramatic ways. No warnings, no miracles, just small interruptions, pauses, redirections. The kind of protection that looks like coincidence until it happens again, and again, and again. The neighbor started keeping notes, not because she believed something supernatural was happening. At least that's what she told herself. She said it was for routine, for consistency, for the child's safety. But the truth was simpler. She was trying to understand the pattern. Every time something almost went wrong, it didn't end in chaos. It ended in interruption. Not a dramatic stop, just a pause. Like someone gently placing a hand between the child and the world, saying, "Not this." The first entry in her notebook was the stove. The second was the gate. She wrote them down with dates, times, and short descriptions. Nothing emotional, nothing exaggerated, just facts. Kitchen. Burner on. Child stopped. Before touching. Backyard gate open. Child turned back. She told herself that if she wrote it down, it would become smaller, manageable. It didn't. A week later, it happened again. The girl had found a step stool in the bathroom. It wasn't supposed to be there. The neighbor was sure of that. She had moved it to the laundry room after the first few days, specifically to keep the girl from climbing. But there it was, right in front of the sink. The girl stood on it, stretching her arms upward, fingers reaching for the cabinet above. Inside that cabinet were things that didn't belong in small hands. Cleaning products, sharp edges, objects that were only safe because adults knew they were there. The neighbor was in the hallway when she saw it. She called out the girl's name. The girl didn't respond. She was focused, determined. The neighbor rushed forward, but she was too late. The stool wobbled, just a little, enough to make the girl lose her balance. The neighbor braced herself for the sound she expected. The thud, the cry. Instead, the stool tipped forward and fell flat. The girl dropped down safely onto her feet. No fall, no injury. The cabinet door above her swung shut at the same time. The neighbor stood there, frozen. She didn't remember the cabinet being open. She didn't remember leaving the stool anywhere near the bathroom. She crouched down, hands shaking, and hugged the girl tightly. The girl hugged back, calm as ever. "It's okay," she said softly. "Mom fixed it." That night, the neighbor cried. Not from fear. From the sudden, overwhelming realization that whatever was happening wasn't random. It was specific, intentional, protective. She stopped writing notes after that. Writing it down felt disrespectful now, like she was trying to trap something that didn't belong on paper. Instead, she started watching more carefully. The girl's habits, her pauses, the moments when she stopped mid-motion, eyes unfocused, like she was listening to something that didn't make sound. The girl never described a voice, never said her mother told her what to do. It was always phrased the same way. She wouldn't like that. She already did it. She fixed it. As if the mother's presence wasn't separate from the world around her. as if it was woven into the environment itself. One afternoon, the neighbor decided to test something. Not intentionally, it just happened. She left a bottle of medicine on the counter after taking a dose. She realized it almost immediately and turned to grab it. The girl was already there. Looking at it, the neighbor took a step forward. The bottle rolled. Not off the counter, just enough to knock against the backsplash and stop. The girl watched it, then turned away. "I'm not supposed to," she said. The neighbor's heart pounded. "Who told you that?" she asked quietly. The girl shrugged. "I just know." That was when the neighbor stopped questioning whether the mother was gone. Gone wasn't the right word. Absent didn't fit either. The mother wasn't doing things, she was preventing them, guiding outcomes by removing the worst possible version of a moment. The neighbor thought about how parents protect children when they're alive. They don't hover constantly. They don't explain every danger. They adjust the world quietly. They move things out of reach. They lock doors. They turn knobs. They intervene without announcing themselves. And the realization hit her harder than anything else had. Nothing about this felt unfamiliar. It felt maternal. Weeks passed. The girl started preschool. The neighbor walked her there on the first day, held her hand, knelt down to fix her jacket. "You'll be okay," she said. The girl nodded. "I know." Inside the classroom, the teacher smiled warmly and waved them in. The neighbor turned to leave. Halfway down the hallway, she heard the teacher's voice sharpen. "Wait!" A chair had been pushed too close to the edge of a table. A child leaned back. The neighbor spun around. But the chair scraped forward instead. The fall never happened. The teacher frowned, confused, then continued like nothing had gone wrong. The girl looked up from her seat and met the neighbor's eyes. She smiled. Just a little. The neighbor understood then that this wasn't something that would stop. Not soon. Not easily. And maybe not ever. Some mothers don't leave the moment the world says they're gone. Some stay. Not as shadows, not as warnings, but as the quiet hand that keeps small lives moving forward. One interrupted danger at a time. It didn't take long for other people to notice. Not all at once, not dramatically, just in small, uncomfortable moments when something almost happened, and didn't. At preschool, the teachers started talking. Quietly at first, they noticed how the girl never seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. When other children ran without looking, she paused. When toys were thrown, they missed her by inches. When doors swung open too fast, she was never behind them. It wasn't that she was careful. She was 3. She tripped, she spilled. She laughed too loud and cried too easily. But danger seemed to curve around her. One teacher mentioned it during a lunch break. "It's strange," she said, lowering her voice. "She's always fine, even when she shouldn't be." Another teacher shrugged. "Some kids are just lucky." Lucky. That word followed the girl home. The neighbor heard it when she picked her up one afternoon. "Very lucky," the teacher repeated, with a smile. "She almost fell off the slide today." Almost. The neighbor didn't smile back. She had learned that almost was the most important word in the girl's life. That evening, the neighbor sat at the kitchen table while the girl colored quietly beside her. "Do you ever feel scared?" the neighbor asked, keeping her tone casual. The girl thought about it. "No." "Never?" The girl shook her head. "Not really." "Why not?" The girl didn't answer right away. She pressed the crayon harder, against the paper, drawing slow circles. "Because I don't get hurt," she said finally. The neighbor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room. "That's good," she said softly. The girl looked up. "Mom wouldn't let me." The neighbor swallowed. She didn't correct her. She didn't ask questions. Some truths don't need confirmation. A few days later, the girl's aunt came to visit. She hadn't been around much since the funeral. Grief had taken her elsewhere. But now, standing in the living room, she looked at the girl with a mix of relief and guilt. "You're getting so big," she said, kneeling down. The girl studied her face. "You cry when you think about Mom," the girl said. The aunt froze. "I do?" The girl nodded. "She doesn't like that." The aunt laughed awkwardly. "She doesn't?" The girl shook her head. "She wants you to eat." That night, the aunt stayed for dinner. She insisted on helping. She chopped vegetables too fast. She left the oven preheating while she stepped away to take a call. The neighbor noticed immediately. She moved toward the kitchen. Before she reached it, the oven beeped. Not a warning, not an error, just the end of a cycle. The oven had shut itself off. The aunt stared at it. "That's weird," she said. The neighbor said nothing. Later, after the girl was asleep, the aunt whispered, "Has she been saying things?" The neighbor didn't pretend not to understand. "Yes," she said. "About her mother?" "Yes." The aunt pressed her lips together. "I thought she might forget," she said quietly. The neighbor shook her head. "She hasn't." The aunt looked around the house. "I keep feeling like someone's making sure things don't go wrong here." The neighbor met her eyes. "So do I." They didn't say anything else. Outside, the night moved on like it always did. Cars passed. Lights flickered in distant windows. Life continued. Inside the house, the girl slept peacefully. She didn't dream loudly. She didn't cry out. She slept the way children do when they feel safe. Days turned into weeks. The girl grew. Not fast. Not suddenly. Just enough that people began to relax. The danger didn't feel as sharp anymore. The neighbor found herself breathing easier. That's when the world tested the pattern. It happened at the park, a busy afternoon, children everywhere. The girl was on the swings. The neighbor stood nearby, watching. A boy ran behind the swing set, not paying attention. Too close, too fast. The neighbor shouted. Too late. The swing arced forward. But the chain slipped. Just enough. The swing slowed. The impact never came. The boy stumbled back, confused. The girl laughed. The neighbor's heart hammered against her ribs. A stranger standing nearby muttered, "That was close." The neighbor nodded. Yes. Always close. That night, the neighbor sat alone after the girl was asleep. She didn't try to rationalize anymore. She didn't look for explanations. She accepted what she was seeing for what it was. Protection doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up as timing, as friction, as resistance where none should exist. Sometimes it's the absence of tragedy. The neighbor whispered into the quiet room, "She's okay." The house stayed silent, but the silence felt different now, full, as if it was listening. People like explanations. They don't need them to be true. They just need them to be comforting. At preschool, the teachers started adjusting their language. "She's cautious," one said. "She's observant," another added. Some kids are just wired differently. The girl listened to none of it. She continued being exactly what she had always been, small, curious, and strangely untouched by the chaos that surrounded children her age. When other kids scraped knees, hers stayed clean. When someone pushed too hard, she stepped aside at the right moment. When things fell, they missed her. Parents noticed. Not enough to accuse, just enough to whisper. One mother joked that the girl had a sixth sense. Another said she must have guardian instincts. The neighbor heard it all during pickup time. She smiled politely. She nodded. She didn't correct them, because correcting them would mean admitting something she wasn't sure she was ready to say out loud. One afternoon, a man from the building's management came by to check the gas lines. Routine inspection. The neighbor stood in the kitchen with him, arms crossed, watching. He turned the knobs, tested the connections, scribbled notes on a clipboard. "Everything looks fine," he said. "You're lucky. Some of these old buildings can be dangerous." Lucky. Again. He reached for one knob to turn it off. It was already off. He frowned. "I must have checked that one already," he muttered. The neighbor said nothing. After he left, she stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. She thought about the first night, about the stove, about the timing. She wondered how many times danger had been removed before it even had a chance to show itself. That evening, the girl sat at the table eating slowly. The neighbor watched her closely. "Do you remember the stove?" she asked carefully. The girl nodded. "Do you remember stopping?" The neighbor continued. "Yes." "Why did you stop?" The girl chewed thoughtfully. "I felt like I should." "Like a thought?" The girl shook her head. "Like when you don't want to do something," she said. "But you don't know why." The neighbor felt her chest tighten. "That's called a feeling," she said. The girl smiled. "Mom gives me those." The neighbor looked away before the girl could see her eyes fill. Later that night, the neighbor called a friend, someone practical, someone grounded. She explained everything without embellishment. No ghosts, no miracles, just patterns, pauses, near misses, interventions that didn't announce themselves. Her friend listened quietly, then said, "Trauma can do that. Kids adapt. They become hyper-aware." The neighbor nodded. That explanation made sense. It fit neatly. It should have ended there. But then the friend added, "Still, it's odd. The timing, I mean, odd." The neighbor hung up and sat in the dark. She realized something important then. If this had been happening to an adult, people would have called it instinct. If it had been happening to an animal, they would have called it intuition. But because it was a child, and because her mother was gone, people kept looking for a way to separate the two, as if protection had an expiration date, as if love ended when someone stopped breathing. The neighbor went to bed uneasy, not because she was afraid, but because she was starting to understand that this wasn't a phase. This wasn't grief playing tricks. This was continuity. The girl's world hadn't lost its protector. It had simply changed how protection looked. The next day, something finally went wrong. Or at least, it tried to. The girl was walking home with the neighbor when a car sped past the corner too fast. The driver wasn't paying attention. The crosswalk light flickered. The girl stepped forward. The neighbor grabbed her hand. At the same time, the car slammed on its brakes. The tires screeched. The car stopped inches short. The driver shouted an apology through the open window, shaken. The neighbor pulled the girl back, heart pounding. The girl looked up at her, confused. "Why did you stop?" the neighbor asked, still catching her breath. The girl frowned. "You stopped me first," she said. The neighbor shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I didn't." The girl tilted her head. "Yes, you did," she insisted. "Just before." The neighbor's hand trembled. She replayed the moment. She remembered reaching for the girl. She remembered panic. But she didn't remember touching her until after. Something had slowed the girl. Something had delayed the step just enough. That night, the neighbor stood in the doorway of the girl's room. She watched her sleep, the steady rise and fall of her chest. She whispered into the quiet. "You can rest," she said. "I've got her." The room remained still, but the neighbor felt something she hadn't felt before. Relief. As if someone had been waiting to hear that. As if protection didn't need to be exclusive. As if love, when it's real, makes room. The problem with patterns is that once you see them, you start trusting them. The neighbor didn't mean to. She never said it out loud. Never thought, She'll be fine. But somewhere between the near misses and the quiet interventions, her body began to relax in ways it hadn't before. She still watched closely. She still checked locks. She still scanned rooms before letting the girl wander. But the edge of panic dulled. That's when the world tends to remind you why panic exists. It happened on a warm afternoon, the kind where everything feels slower than it should. The neighbor was sorting mail at the kitchen counter. The girl was in the living room, playing with blocks. The windows were open. Outside, the street hummed with the low, distant sound of traffic. The neighbor's phone buzzed. A message. She looked down, just for a second. That's all it ever takes. The sound came from the bathroom. Water. Running. The neighbor's head snapped up. She dropped the mail and moved fast. Too fast for calm. Too slow for comfort. The bathroom door was half open. Inside, the tub faucet was on. Not full blast. Just enough. The girl stood on the step stool again. She had pushed it there herself this time. She was, leaning over the tub, fascinated by the way the water curled into itself as it disappeared down the drain. The neighbor lunged. "Hey!" The stool shifted. The girl's foot slipped. For the first time, there was no pause, no hesitation, no invisible delay. The girl tipped forward. The neighbor's heart stopped. Her hands grabbed air. Time compressed into a single, unbearable instant. Then the girl didn't fall. She stopped short. Her body jolted as if something had pulled her backward by the center of her chest. She stumbled, landed on her knees, and sat there blinking. The neighbor collapsed to the floor beside her, shaking. She pulled the girl into her arms, holding her too tight, breath coming in broken gasps. The girl didn't cry. She didn't even seem startled. She just looked up and said, "That was close." The neighbor laughed, then cried, then laughed again, the sound tearing out of her like something that had been held in too long. She shut off the water with trembling hands. She moved the stool out of the bathroom entirely. She locked it in the laundry room. She sat on the floor with the girl until her heartbeat slowed. Later that night, after the girl was asleep, the neighbor stood alone in the bathroom. She replayed the moment again and again. The difference this time wasn't what happened. It was how it felt. This time, it hadn't been gentle. It hadn't been a nudge or a pause. It had been urgent, forceful, like someone had grabbed the girl without asking permission. The neighbor realized something she hadn't wanted to admit before. The protection wasn't infinite. It wasn't guaranteed. It responded to risk, and that meant risk was still allowed to exist. She sat on the edge of the tub, staring at the drain. What if she hadn't been there at all? What if she had been outside, or asleep, or distracted for longer than a second? The thought made her stomach turn. She understood then that whatever was watching over the girl wasn't replacing the living. It was supplementing them, backing them up, stepping in when it had to, but never removing responsibility. The next day, the neighbor made changes, real ones. She installed child locks on every cabinet. She added covers to every outlet. She placed gates where she'd thought they weren't needed. She wasn't taking chances anymore. If protection existed, it deserved help. The girl watched all of this with mild interest. "You're busy today," she said. "I am," the neighbor replied. "Mom likes it when you help," the girl added. The neighbor paused. "She does?" The girl nodded. "She doesn't want you tired." The neighbor felt tears sting her eyes. "I'll try," she whispered. That afternoon, the girl napped longer than usual. The neighbor sat nearby watching her sleep. For the first time, she felt something new. Not fear, not awe, respect. Whatever was happening wasn't about control, it was about care. The kind that adjusts, the kind that reacts, the kind that doesn't need credit. That night, the neighbor dreamed. She was standing in the kitchen, back turned. She heard a pot rattle. She turned. The stove was off. Someone stood between her and the girl. She couldn't see their face, only their posture. Protective, familiar. She woke with her heart pounding, not afraid, grateful. The next morning, the girl woke up smiling. "Mom says you did good," she said casually, reaching for her cereal. The neighbor laughed softly, shaking her head. "Tell her thank you," she said. The girl nodded as if that message would be delivered as easily as any other. Outside, life went on. Cars sped, doors slammed, people made mistakes. Inside that house, danger still existed, but it didn't rule, not anymore. Time did what it always does. It moved, quietly, relentlessly. The girl didn't stay 3 forever. Her legs grew longer. Her words became clearer. Her questions became sharper. And with each small change, the world adjusted around her. So did the protection. The neighbor noticed it first in the way. The pauses changed. When the girl was younger, the interruptions had been physical. A step delayed. An object shifted. A moment redirected. Now they were subtler, internal. The girl would stop mid-sentence, eyes unfocused for half a second, then change her mind. She would reach for something and decide against it without knowing why. She would feel uneasy in places that looked perfectly safe. The neighbor watched it happen again and again. At first, she worried. Was the girl anxious? Was she learning fear? But fear didn't look like this. Fear panicked. Fear froze. This was different. This was awareness. One afternoon, the girl was invited to a classmate's birthday party. A loud place. Crowded. Chaotic. The neighbor stood at the doorway watching children run past with balloons and cake-covered hands. The girl hesitated. "You don't have to go in yet," the neighbor said gently. The girl nodded, then shook her head. "I don't think I should," she said. "Why not?" The girl frowned, searching for the words. "It feels busy," she said, "like something's too fast." The neighbor glanced inside. Everything looked normal, but she trusted that feeling now. "Okay," she said. "We can wait." 5 minutes later, a shelf tipped over, not dramatically, not dangerously, but enough to send toys scattering and parents scrambling. The girl watched from the doorway, calm. The neighbor felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Protection didn't always stop things from happening. Sometimes it simply kept the girl out of their path. At school, the teachers noticed a change, too. The girl wasn't just lucky anymore. She was thoughtful. She didn't follow crowds, didn't rush decisions. When other children climbed higher, she climbed slower. When someone dared her to jump, she declined. "She's very cautious," one teacher said during a meeting. The neighbor nodded. "She listens to herself," she replied. She didn't say more. The girl started asking questions about her mother, not in sadness, not in longing, in curiosity. What was she like when she was little? Did she like loud places? Was she scared of things? The neighbor answered carefully. "She was brave," she said, "but she knew when to step back." The girl seemed pleased by that. "I think I'm like her," she said one evening. The neighbor smiled. "I think you are, too." One night, a storm rolled in unexpectedly, the kind that rattled windows and knocked power out across the neighborhood. The neighbor lit candles and guided the girl to the living room. They sat together, wrapped in blankets, listening to rain drum against the roof. The girl wasn't scared. She watched the candle flame flicker. "She doesn't like storms," the girl said suddenly. The neighbor looked at her. "Your mom?" The girl nodded. She used to count seconds between the thunder. The neighbor hadn't known that. She hadn't known much about the mother's childhood, yet the detail felt right. The thunder cracked loudly overhead. The girl flinched. Then she took a breath. Slow. Measured. Just like someone had taught her. "She says it's far away," the girl added. The storm passed without incident. No trees fell, no windows broke. But the neighbor understood something important that night. The protection wasn't just preventing harm, it was teaching. The girl wasn't being shielded from the world, she was being prepared for it. Weeks later, the neighbor noticed something that unsettled her more than any near miss ever had. The girl began correcting adults, not rudely, not arrogantly, gently. "Maybe we should wait," she would say. "I don't think that's a good idea. Can we do it another way?" And more often than not, she was right. Once, a teacher ignored her suggestion to move a group indoors before recess. Rain followed minutes later. Another time, the neighbor dismissed her discomfort about a babysitter's house. They left early anyway because the girl wouldn't settle. Later that evening, they heard about an accident on that street. The neighbor stopped brushing these moments off. She started listening, really listening. Not because she believed the girl knew the future, but because she understood now that some knowledge doesn't come from foresight. It comes from care, from attention sharpened by love. The girl wasn't being guided step by step anymore. She was being nudged toward becoming her own guardian. One evening, as they walked home from the store, the girl stopped suddenly. "What is it?" the neighbor asked. The girl looked up at the sky, then around the street. "I think we should go the long way," she said. The neighbor hesitated. It was late. She was tired. "Okay," she said. They took the longer route. Later, they heard sirens near the shortcut they'd avoided. The neighbor didn't ask questions. She just squeezed the girl's hand. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" the girl asked. "For paying attention." The girl smiled. "That's what moms do," she said. The neighbor's throat tightened. That night, as the girl slept, the neighbor sat nearby and thought about the future, about adolescence, about independence, about letting go. She wondered how long this protection would last, if it would fade, if it would step back, or if it would transform into something quieter still. She realized then that protection doesn't mean holding on forever. Sometimes it means teaching someone how to notice danger themselves, how to feel when something is off, how to trust that feeling. The girl stirred in her sleep, then settled again. The neighbor whispered into the darkness. "She's learning." The room stayed silent, but the silence felt approving, as if something had smiled. The world doesn't care how careful you are. It doesn't slow down because someone is learning. It doesn't pause out of respect for growth. It pushes harder. The neighbor realized this the day the girl almost disappeared. They were at the community pool, a place that felt safe by design, bright colors, lifeguards, parents everywhere. The girl was older now, confident enough to move without holding a hand, curious enough to explore beyond arm's reach. The neighbor sat at the edge of the pool, watching closely. Always watching. The girl splashed near the shallow end with other children, laughing. Then someone bumped into someone else. A chain reaction. The girl lost her footing. The neighbor stood instantly. But before panic could take shape, the girl surfaced. Coughing. Startled. Fine. The lifeguard moved in, so did the neighbor. It was handled quickly. Too quickly. Everyone relaxed, except the girl. She climbed out of the pool and wrapped herself in a towel. Her hands shook. "You okay?" the neighbor asked, kneeling. The girl nodded slowly. Then she said something unexpected. She didn't like that. The neighbor felt her stomach drop. "She?" she asked. The girl nodded. She was scared. The neighbor followed her gaze. The water, the crowd, the noise. "She doesn't like when I can't breathe," the girl added. The neighbor swallowed hard. That night, the girl had trouble sleeping. She woke twice, disoriented. The neighbor sat beside her bed, rubbing her back. "You're safe," she whispered. The girl didn't answer right away. "She stayed close today," she said finally. The neighbor's chest tightened. "How do you know?" The girl frowned, as if the answer were obvious. "Because I felt heavy," she said. "Like when someone hugs you too hard." The neighbor didn't sleep after that. She thought about the pool, about the water, about how quickly something had almost gone wrong. She realized that until now, danger had been manageable, domestic, predictable. This was different. This was the world. A few weeks later, the girl was invited to a school field trip, a museum downtown, crowded streets, buses, schedules. The neighbor signed the permission slip with hesitation. The night before the trip, the girl was quiet. Too quiet. "Are you excited?" the neighbor asked. The girl shrugged. "I don't think I should go," she said. The neighbor sat beside her. "Why?" The girl stared at her hands. "It feels loud," she said. "Not noise, busy loud." The neighbor felt that familiar pull in her chest, the one she'd learned not to ignore. She called the school, made an excuse. The girl stayed home. That afternoon, news broke. A traffic accident involving a bus. Not the school's bus, but close. Same route, same timing. The neighbor stared at the screen. She didn't celebrate. She didn't feel relief. She felt respect. Whatever was guiding the girl wasn't stopping events. It was steering her around them. As the girl grew, the protection adapted. It didn't intervene constantly. It intervened when the stakes were too high, when consequences couldn't be undone. That realization frightened the neighbor more than anything else had, because it meant the world was still dangerous, and because it meant the protection was choosing its moments. The girl began to withdraw from certain situations, not socially, not emotionally, selectively. She avoided certain streets, certain people, certain places. When asked why, she struggled to explain. "I just don't feel right there," she'd say. Adults brushed it off. "She's sensitive. She's imaginative." The neighbor didn't correct them. She watched. One evening, the girl and the neighbor were walking home when the streetlights flickered. Not dramatically, just enough. The girl stopped. "We should go inside," she said. "It's early," the neighbor replied. "I know." They stepped into the nearest store. Minutes later, a power outage hit the block. Darkness, confusion. A minor accident followed at the intersection outside. Nothing fatal, but enough to draw attention. The neighbor looked at the girl. The girl looked back. "She doesn't like when it's hard to see," she said. The neighbor felt tears sting her eyes. "How do you know all this?" she asked quietly. The girl didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer had been there since the stove, since the gate, since the bathroom, since the pool. Some people leave behind memories, others leave behind habits, and some leave behind protection. The neighbor realized then that the girl wasn't being guarded from every mistake. She was being guided away from the ones that couldn't be fixed. That night, the neighbor sat alone after the girl fell asleep. She imagined the mother, not as a figure, not as a voice, as attention, as awareness sharpened by love. She whispered into the quiet, "You're tired, aren't you?" The room stayed still, but for the first time, the neighbor felt something else beneath the silence. Strain, as if protection, no matter how strong, came at a cost. The fear didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as responsibility. The neighbor began checking the doors twice, then 3 times. She walked the girl to school even when she was old enough to go with friends. She avoided certain places without being able to explain why. She told herself it was normal, that this was what caretakers did. But deep down, she knew that wasn't it. She wasn't afraid of the world. She was afraid of the moment the world would finally move faster than whatever had been keeping the girl safe. The girl noticed the change. "You don't have to worry so much," she said one evening while they brushed their teeth side by side. The neighbor smiled at the mirror. "I know," she said. "It's just my job." The girl studied her reflection. "She worries when you worry," she said. "The D." Neighbor paused. "Who does?" The girl shrugged. "You know." The neighbor rinsed her mouth slowly. That night, she dreamed again. This time, the kitchen was dark. The stove was cold. The pot was gone. The girl stood alone in the center of the room. No one stepped in. No one slowed time. The neighbor woke with a gasp. She sat upright, heart racing, listening for sounds from the girl's room. Everything was quiet. She walked down the hallway and stood in the doorway, watching the girl sleep. Safe. Still breathing. The neighbor rested her forehead against the doorframe. She realized something she hadn't before. Up until now, she had assumed the protection was automatic, that it would always be there. But what if it wasn't? What if it was finite? The thought followed her into the next day. The girl was invited to a sleepover, her first, a house across town. Parents the neighbor didn't know well. The girl was excited, too excited. The neighbor hesitated. She met the other parents, asked questions, checked exits with her eyes without meaning to. Everything seemed fine, too fine. That night, after she left the girl there, the neighbor sat alone in her apartment, unable to focus. Her phone buzzed, a message. "We had a small scare, but everything's okay." The neighbor's heart dropped. She called immediately. The other parent explained quickly. The girl had wandered into the backyard after dark. There was a pool, uncovered. She had been found standing at the edge, staring at the water. She hadn't fallen. She hadn't slipped. She had just stopped. "I don't know why," the parent said nervously. "She just froze." The neighbor thanked them and hung up. Her hands shook. She didn't sleep. The next morning, she picked the girl up early. "Did something happen last night?" she asked gently. The girl nodded. "The water was loud," she said. "Loud?" The girl pressed her lips together. "She didn't like it." The neighbor exhaled slowly. "But nothing happened," she said, trying to reassure herself as much as the girl. The girl looked up at her. "She was tired," she said. The neighbor's heart twisted. "Tired?" The girl nodded. "Like when you hold something heavy for too long." The neighbor said nothing. That was the moment the fear stopped being theoretical. Protection, like anything else, could wear down. That night, the neighbor sat at the table with a notebook open in front of her. She hadn't written anything in it for months. Now, she wrote one line. "What happens when I'm not there?" The question stared back at her. She thought about the girl growing older, about independence, about the day she wouldn't be able to hover without suffocating her. The protection had adapted before, but would it adapt forever? The next day, something small but unsettling happened. The girl tripped on the sidewalk. Nothing serious. Scraped knee, tears. The neighbor rushed to her side, heart pounding. It wasn't the fall that scared her. It was the absence. No pause, no redirection. Just gravity doing what it does. The girl cried for a minute, then stopped. "It's okay," she said. "She can't stop everything." The neighbor froze. She asked. The girl nodded. "She lets me learn some things." The neighbor hugged her tightly, too tightly. "I don't want you to get hurt," she whispered. The girl leaned into her. "I will," she said softly, "just not the bad kind." That night, the neighbor stood by the window, watching the streetlights glow. She understood now that protection wasn't about removing pain. It was about preventing the kind of pain that ends stories too early, the kind that doesn't allow for learning, the kind that doesn't heal. She whispered into the quiet, "I'm scared." The silence answered in the only way it ever had, by holding. The moment arrived without warning. It didn't come with alarms or signs or that tightening in the chest the neighbor had learned to trust. It came on an ordinary morning. Clear sky, normal traffic, routine, the kind of day people assume will stay harmless simply because it begins that way. The neighbor had an appointment across town, something unavoidable, something she couldn't bring the girl along for. For the first time in a long while, the girl would be somewhere without her. School had arranged an after-hours activity, supervised, safe on paper. The neighbor stood in the doorway, keys in hand, uncertainty pressing down on her. "You'll be okay?" she asked. The girl nodded. "You don't have to wait," the girl said calmly. "She will?" The neighbor swallowed. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew. The girl didn't answer. She just smiled and walked toward the classroom. The door closed. The neighbor sat in her car longer than necessary. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving. She felt like she was leaving something fragile behind, something that had never truly been hers to protect alone. Across town, the girl sat at a table with other children, drawing and laughing. The room was loud, but controlled. The teacher stepped out briefly to speak with another staff member. Just for a minute. That's when it happened. A boy ran too fast. A chair tipped. A shelf shifted. Heavy objects don't need intention. They just fall. The shelf leaned forward. The girl looked up. Time narrowed. Other children screamed. Someone shouted. The shelf began to tip, and then it stopped. Not completely, just enough. It leaned against the wall at an angle that shouldn't have held. The girl sat perfectly still, beneath it, heart pounding, breath shallow. Someone rushed in. Hands grabbed the shelf. The danger passed. Adults swarmed the room. The girl was checked, unhurt. When asked what happened, no one had an answer. The shelf bolts were loose, but not broken. The angle made no sense. Later, when the neighbor arrived, pale and shaking, the girl ran to her. "I told her you'd be gone," the girl said. The neighbor knelt and held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, grounding herself in the fact that the girl was here, alive. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. The girl pulled back just enough to look at her. "She knew," the girl said. "So she stayed." The neighbor closed her eyes. That night, she didn't try to reason. She didn't look for explanations. She accepted something she'd been circling for months. Protection wasn't automatic. It was deliberate, and it responded to love, trust, and absence alike. Later, after the girl was asleep, the neighbor sat alone on the couch. The house was quiet. She whispered into the stillness. "I didn't know if you could do it without me." The silence felt heavy. Then, lighter. Not like a voice, not like a sign, like a release. As if something had been holding its breath. The neighbor realized something important then. She hadn't been sharing responsibility, she had been sharing trust. And today she had trusted enough to step away. The protection hadn't failed. It had stepped forward. She didn't know how long it could last. She didn't know if it would always be there. But she understood now that love doesn't compete. It collaborates. That night, the girl slept deeply. No restless movements, no murmurs, just peace. Before turning off the light, the neighbor paused. She said the words she hadn't said before. "You don't have to carry it all." The room remained still. But for the first time, the neighbor felt certain. Whatever had been protecting the girl wasn't doing it alone anymore. And neither was she. Understanding doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments. in questions asked sideways, in pauses before decisions, in the space between impulse and action. The girl didn't suddenly know what was happening. She sensed it, like a weather change you feel in your bones before the sky shifts. After the incident with the shelf, something in her changed. Not fear, not anxiety, responsibility. She became more deliberate. When other children ran, she watched first. When choices appeared, she weighed them. The neighbor noticed the difference immediately. "You're thinking a lot today," she said one afternoon as they walked home. The girl nodded. "She doesn't like when I rush," she replied. The neighbor stopped walking. "Why do you think that is?" she asked gently. The girl thought for a long moment. "Because rushing makes things fall," she said. It was the simplest explanation, and the most accurate. That night, the girl asked something she had never asked before. "Does Mom get tired?" she said, lying on her back, staring at the ceiling. The neighbor froze. "Tired how?" The girl shrugged. "Like when you carry groceries and your arms hurt." The neighbor swallowed. "I don't know," she said honestly. The girl nodded, accepting the answer. "She rests when I'm careful," the girl said softly. The words stayed with the neighbor long after the lights were out. The next few weeks tested that idea, not with danger, with restraint. The girl avoided things she used to love. She stepped back from climbing games. She declined invitations that felt overwhelming. She chose quiet over excitement more often than not. At first, the neighbor worried. Was the girl limiting herself? Was she shrinking her world? But then she noticed something else. The girl wasn't withdrawing. She was choosing, and when she chose, things went right. Not perfectly, not magically, but safely. One afternoon, the girl stood at the top of a small hill in the park. Other children rolled down, laughing. She watched them. She hesitated. The neighbor waited, resisting the urge to guide her. The girl took a breath. Then she sat down. Not at the edge, a few feet back. She rolled, slowly, controlled. She reached the bottom without incident and stood up smiling. "That was better," she said. The neighbor smiled too. The protection wasn't preventing experience. It was refining it. That evening, the girl asked another question. "Will she always do it?" she asked, tracing shapes on the table. "Do what?" the neighbor asked. "Help." The neighbor considered her answer carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that she helps when you need it. And when you don't, she lets you be strong on your own." The girl nodded, satisfied. "I want to help too," she said. The neighbor's heart tightened. "Who do you want to help?" The girl shrugged. "Whoever needs it." The idea unsettled the neighbor at first, not because it was wrong, because it was familiar. The girl was becoming something the mother had been, aware, attentive, quietly, protective. The world noticed, too. Teachers remarked on her judgment. Parents trusted her instincts. "She's wise," someone said once. The neighbor didn't correct them. Wisdom isn't always about knowing more. Sometimes it's about listening better. The first real test came unexpectedly. The girls' school organized a trip to a nature center, hiking trails, uneven ground, streams. The neighbor felt her chest tighten as she read the permission slip. "You don't have to go," she said. The girl looked up at her. "I think I should," she said. "Why?" The girl paused. "She's okay with it." The neighbor closed her eyes briefly. "Okay," she said. The day of the trip, the neighbor waited anxiously for updates. None came. That was the hardest part, trusting silence. When the girl came home, muddy and smiling, the neighbor hugged her tightly. "How was it?" she asked. "Good," the girl said. "I fell once." The neighbor stiffened. "But it was okay," the girl added quickly. "I knew where to land." That night, the neighbor lay awake, thinking. The girl had fallen, and nothing had intervened. No pause, no redirection, just learning. And that, the neighbor realized, was the point. Protection wasn't about erasing every fall. It was about preserving the future, about making sure there would still be time to learn. A few days later, the girl surprised her again. They were crossing a busy street when the girl stopped abruptly. The neighbor followed her lead. A cyclist sped past unseen. The girl exhaled. "Thank you," she said quietly. The neighbor looked at her. "Who were you talking to?" The girl smiled. "Both of you." The neighbor felt tears rise. That night, she stood in the doorway and watched the girl sleep. She thought about the stove, the gate, the bathroom, the shelf. All the moments that could have ended differently. And she understood something she hadn't before. The protection wasn't about keeping the girl small. It was about keeping her alive long enough to grow. The girl shifted in her sleep, murmured something unintelligible, then settled again. The neighbor whispered into the quiet. "She's learning." The silence felt warm, supportive, as if something unseen agreed. The first time the protection stepped back, no one announced it. There was no warning, no uneasy feeling in the air, no signal to brace for something important. It felt like any other day. The girl was older now, not much older, but enough. Old enough to tie her own shoes, old enough to argue her point, old enough to want space. She wanted to walk home from school with friends, just a few blocks, just once. The neighbor hesitated. The route was familiar, the traffic predictable, the time of day busy but not chaotic. Every rational part of her said yes. Every instinct shaped by years of near misses said no. "You'll be careful?" the neighbor asked. The girl nodded. "I always am." That answer didn't carry arrogance. It carried confidence. And something else. Understanding. The neighbor watched from the sidewalk as the girl joined her friends and started down the street. She didn't follow. That was new. She stood there until they disappeared around the corner, then turned back toward the apartment with a tightness in her chest she couldn't name. The girl walked slowly, not lagging, not rushing. She listened, not with her ears, but with that quiet awareness that had grown alongside her. The group approached the intersection. The light was green. Cars waited. Someone laughed. Someone ran ahead. The girl stopped. Her friends didn't. They stepped forward. The girl felt it then. Nothing. No pause imposed from outside. No invisible pressure in her chest. No subtle resistance in her limbs. Just choice. She looked at the street, at the cars, at the drivers, at the timing. The light changed. Her friends were already across. She waited. A car surged forward late, rushing the yellow. It passed where she would have been. Her heart pounded, but she didn't feel saved. She felt correct. She crossed when it was right. When she got home, the neighbor was waiting. "How was it?" she asked. The girl smiled. "Good. Anything happen?" The girl shook her head, then paused. "I waited," she said. The neighbor nodded slowly. "I know." That night, the girl asked something different. "Does she trust me?" she asked, lying on her side, staring at the wall. The neighbor didn't answer immediately. "I think," she said carefully, "that she's been preparing you." The girl considered. That. "I didn't feel her today," she said. The neighbor's chest tightened. "How did that feel?" The girl searched for the word. "Quiet," she said, "but not empty." The neighbor understood. Protection wasn't gone. It was withheld, purposefully. The next few days followed the same pattern. The girl made choices, good ones, careful ones. She tripped once and scraped her elbow. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look upset. She cleaned it herself. "I know how," she said. That night, the neighbor stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the stove. She remembered the first day, the glow, the pause, the step back. She realized then that that moment had never been about stopping the girl. It had been about teaching her to stop herself. The girl came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. "She's still there," the girl said casually. The neighbor looked at her. "How do you know?" The girl smiled faintly. "She doesn't need to hold my hand anymore." The words hit harder than any close call ever had, because they meant growth, and growth meant distance. The neighbor felt the familiar urge to ask questions, to press for clarity, for rules, for limits. She resisted it. Some relationships don't survive interrogation. That night, the neighbor dreamed again. This time she stood at the edge of a room. The girl walked ahead, confident. Someone stood behind her, not touching, not guiding, watching. When the neighbor woke, she felt calm, not relieved, resolved. The girl didn't need constant intervention. She needed trust. The next test came quickly. A school competition, buses, crowds, noise. The neighbor offered to drive separately. The girl declined. "I'll be okay," she said. The neighbor nodded. She meant it this time. During the event, something went wrong. A loud argument. Panic spreading through a group. The girl felt the shift before it became chaos. She stepped away. She led 2 younger children with her. They waited until things settled. No one told her to do that. No one stopped her. When the neighbor heard about it later, she felt something unexpected. Pride. Not because the girl had avoided danger, because she had become the kind of person who notices it. That night, the girl lay in bed quietly. "She watched," the girl said. The neighbor smiled. "But she didn't have to do anything?" The girl nodded. "That means I did." The neighbor kissed her forehead. "Yes," she said. "It does." Outside, the world continued doing what it always does. Moving too fast. Forgetting to be careful. Inside that house, something had shifted. Protection had become wisdom. Intervention had become intuition. And love had learned when to step back. The first time the girl stepped fully into the world alone, she didn't feel like she was carrying anything heavy. It wasn't fear that held her back. It wasn't uncertainty. It was something else, something she had learned over time, something unspoken that had shaped her actions without her even realizing it. Responsibility. The kind that tells you when to stop and when to go. The kind that doesn't wait for someone else to step in. It wasn't a burden. It wasn't a weight. It was freedom. The girl was growing into it. That day, the school had a fire drill, a regular drill, a loud one. The teacher gave the usual instructions. Stay calm. Follow directions. Don't push. The children rushed to the exit, following the crowd without thinking. The girl was one of the last to leave the room. She looked over her shoulder, scanning the hallway. She stopped, waited. Then she stepped aside as a younger child ran past her, eyes wide with fear. The girl caught up with her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Stay with me," she said calmly. The younger child nodded, visibly relieved. When they got outside, the teacher came over, concerned. "Everything okay?" she asked, scanning the children. "Anyone hurt?" The girl nodded. "We're fine." She didn't tell her about the moment of hesitation, about the second when everything seemed too loud, too fast. She didn't need to. She had already acted. That afternoon, the girl sat on the porch, watching the clouds drift by. The neighbor joined her, sitting silently beside her. "You did good today," the neighbor said softly. The girl smiled but didn't respond. She was still thinking. "Mom never told me exactly how to do it," the girl said after a long pause. The neighbor turned to her, eyebrows raised. "Never?" she asked. The girl shook her head. "But she showed me." The neighbor didn't ask for more. She didn't need to. She understood now. The girl wasn't just following instructions. She wasn't relying on protection anymore. She was becoming her own guide. That evening, the neighbor stood in the kitchen, watching the girl set the table. The girl didn't need any help. She did it without thinking. But the neighbor couldn't stop herself from watching how the girl moved. There was something different about her now, something quiet, something intentional. Later, when the girl went to bed, the neighbor sat down at the table and took a deep breath. She realized, with a jolt, that she had been expecting a day like this for a long time. She had expected a time when the girl would no longer need her constant guidance. But she hadn't expected the quiet of it. The way the girl had figured out how to listen to herself. The way she had become the one making decisions. The one taking action. The neighbor stood up and walked down the hallway to the girl's room. She opened the door, just a crack, and peered inside. The girl was asleep, calm, still. The neighbor stood there watching her. She wanted to say something. She wanted to tell her everything she hadn't yet said. But the words didn't come. Instead, she closed the door quietly, leaving the girl to sleep. The next morning, the girl woke up early, like usual. She didn't rush to get ready. She didn't hurry. She took her time, adjusting her clothes and tying her shoes, carefully. She went to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of juice, setting the glass down before reaching for a banana. The neighbor watched her, the same sense of respect growing inside her. The girl didn't need protection in the way she had before. She didn't need a guard. She needed space. She needed trust. "You're going to be fine today?" the neighbor said, after a long silence. The girl looked up, her expression thoughtful. "I know." And that was it, the moment when the neighbor stopped worrying. It wasn't because the world was safe. It wasn't because nothing bad could happen. It was because the girl had learned, without being told, when to trust herself and when to ask for help. That afternoon, the girl went out with friends. The neighbor watched her leave, standing at the door for a moment, feeling both proud and sad. The girl didn't look back. And the neighbor realized then that some moments of growth are quiet. They don't announce themselves. They don't break anything. They just slip by unnoticed. Until one day you wake up and realize that everything has changed. The girl returned home late that evening. The neighbor had been expecting a phone call or a text. Anything to let her know that she had arrived safely. But nothing came. The door opened. The girl stepped inside. She smiled. "I'm home." And that was all. No dramatic moments, no reminders, just a statement. The neighbor smiled, relieved. The girl was learning to carry her own weight, and she wasn't alone. The day the girl decided to walk home alone felt inevitable. It wasn't the kind of decision you announce. It wasn't something she declared with words. It was a silent conclusion. One moment, the girl was waiting for the neighbor to arrive at the usual pickup time. The next, she simply wasn't. The neighbor arrived late, as usual, thinking nothing of it. The sky was a bit darker than she expected, but that didn't concern her. Not at first. She stepped into the schoolyard, looking for the girl. She wasn't there. She checked the usual spots. No sign of her. Her phone buzzed. It was a message. "I'm walking home." The neighbor froze. She blinked. The message came with no explanation, no reasoning, no worry. Just the quiet confidence of someone who knew what they were doing. The neighbor's heart raced. She immediately replied, her hands shaking slightly. "Are you sure? I can come get you?" The reply came quickly. "I'm sure. I'm fine." The neighbor stood still for a moment, the phone still in her hand, feeling the weight of it. She wanted to go after her. She wanted to chase her down and insist on following her. She wanted to tell her that she wasn't ready for this. But something stopped her. It wasn't the fear. It wasn't the concern for her safety. It was the silence. The fact that the girl hadn't asked. The fact that she had made her choice, quietly and decisively. The neighbor checked the time again. The bus wouldn't be here for another 20 minutes. The house was a short walk away. She waited. The message had come from a place of trust, from a place where the girl had learned to act on her own. It wasn't independence in the way people often think of it. It wasn't loud or proud. It was quiet, subtle, steady, and it was real. The girl made it home just fine. She walked up the stairs, through the door, and into the kitchen. The neighbor had tried to stay busy, pretending she wasn't worried, pretending that the moment didn't shake her more than she would admit. The girl came into the kitchen with a slight smile. "I'm home," she said. The neighbor nodded, relieved. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm fine." The girl didn't say more. She didn't need to. She was still learning how to share the space, still figuring out how to live between the moment when you need help and the moment when you don't. The neighbor held her gaze for a moment, then smiled. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. The girl smiled back. "I know." Later that night, the neighbor sat down to reflect. She thought about all the times she had stepped in, all the times she had saved the girl from herself. She had done it because she loved her, because she wanted to protect her. But this was different. This was letting go. The next few days passed without incident. The girl kept making choices, some big, some small. And the neighbor watched, quietly proud and quietly afraid. The more the girl grew, the more she made decisions without her. The more she stepped into the world, without waiting for permission. The more she seemed to trust herself. It was the hardest thing the neighbor had ever done, to stop stepping in. But the more she watched, the more she realized something. The girl wasn't afraid. She wasn't uncertain. She just needed space to make her own decisions. And as hard as it was to admit, the neighbor had given her that space. Not by leaving, not by disappearing, but by stepping back when it was time. There was a different kind of love in that. A love that didn't seek to control, but to trust. That night, the girl sat at the kitchen table, her pencil moving steadily across the page. The neighbor watched her, proud and worried all at once. "Can I ask you something?" the girl said, breaking the silence. The neighbor nodded. "When you were little, did you ever feel like you had to figure it out on your own?" The question caught the neighbor off guard. "Did I?" The girl paused, eyes on her paper. "Yeah," she said softly. "Like when I'm by myself, I'm okay. But sometimes I feel like I need to figure out what to do, on my own." The neighbor took a deep breath. "I think we all do," she said, "but you don't have to figure it all out alone, not if you don't want to." The girl nodded, but there was something in her expression that made the neighbor pause. "I think I already know," the girl said. The neighbor didn't answer. She just watched her. Somewhere, deep inside, she knew that the moment she had feared was coming. The moment when the girl would finally not need her. But for now, she held on to this. For now, she stayed. And maybe, just maybe, that was all the protection the girl would ever need. The challenge didn't come as a disaster. It came as a choice. The kind that looks small to everyone else but feels enormous when you're the one standing in it. It was late afternoon, the sky already shifting toward evening, when the girl's friend asked her to take a shortcut home. "Come on," the friend said, bouncing on her toes. "It's faster." The shortcut wasn't dangerous on paper. It was just a narrow path behind a row of older buildings, a place adults avoided mostly because it was inconvenient, not because it was truly unsafe. A stretch of cracked pavement, a blind corner, a fence with peeling paint. The kind of place where nothing usually happens. Usually. The girl stopped at the entrance to the path. Her friend kept walking and turned back, impatient. "What?" the friend asked. The girl didn't answer right away. She felt it. Not a scream in her head, not panic, just a subtle pressure, like the air itself had thickened. Her chest tightened. The world didn't look different, but it felt different. Busy, loud. The friend rolled her eyes. "You're always so careful." The girl swallowed. She could go the long way and be teased again. Or she could go the shortcut and prove she wasn't scared of shadows. That was the choice, the kind that shapes people. The girl took one step forward. Nothing stopped her. No invisible pause. No sudden distraction. No gentle tug backward. Just her own feet moving where she told them to. She took a second step, and then she heard it. Not a voice. A sound. A small, sharp clink, metal on metal, followed by the soft scrape of something shifting behind the fence. Her friend didn't seem to notice. She was already halfway down the path, humming something under her breath. The girl stopped. Her heartbeat began to climb. She scanned the space the way the neighbor had taught her without ever naming it as teaching. Look first, then move. Her eyes caught something near the blind corner. A figure, partially hidden. Not a monster, not a shadow. A person, someone standing too still. Her friend kept walking. The girl's mind moved quickly, not into fear, but into action. She called her friend's name. Her friend waved without turning around. "What?" The figure behind the fence shifted again. The girl stepped backward. Her friend finally turned, annoyed. The girl's voice came out, steady, even though her hands were cold. "Let's go the other way." Her friend frowned. "Why?" The girl didn't explain. She didn't have the words. "Just, please." Her friend stared at her, irritated. Then she shrugged. "Fine. Whatever." They turned around. They took 2 steps back toward the street. That's when the person moved, fast. Not toward them directly, just out of hiding, cutting across the path like they had been waiting for the moment the girls would commit to the corner. The girl's stomach dropped. Her friend froze. The person paused too, noticing them retreating. For a split second, everything hung in place. The girl didn't think. She grabbed her friend's wrist and pulled. Hard. They ran. Not screaming, not yelling. Just running with every bit of small strength their legs could produce. Behind them, footsteps hit the pavement. 1, 2, 3, close enough that the girl could feel the vibration of them through the ground. Her friend began to cry, breath catching. The girl didn't look back. She aimed for the street, for light, for people. She reached the sidewalk and yanked her friend into the open where cars passed and someone stood outside a store smoking. The footsteps behind them stopped. The person didn't follow into the open. They didn't need to. They had already learned what they needed from the moment, that the girls were paying attention, that they weren't easy. The girl's friend collapsed against the wall, shaking. "What was that?" she whispered. The girl's mouth was dry. "I don't know," she said honestly. Her friend wiped her face with her sleeve. "Why did you stop?" The girl stared at the streetlight above them, blinking hard. "I felt it," she said. Her friend shook her head, still crying. "Felt what?" The girl didn't know how to explain the difference between fear and knowing, between panic and warning. So she said the only thing that was always true, even when it sounded strange. She didn't like it. Her friend stared at her. "Who?" The girl didn't answer, because answering would make it real in a way she wasn't ready for. They walked the long way home in silence. The neighbor opened the door before the girl could knock, as if she'd been standing there waiting. One look at their faces, and the neighbor's expression changed completely. "What happened?" she asked sharply, stepping forward. The girl's friend began talking at once, words tumbling out, shortcut, figure, running, footsteps. The neighbor's hands trembled as she listened. When the friend finally left, escorted to her own building by a parent who had been called, the neighbor closed the door and leaned against it, eyes shining. The girl stood in the living room, still catching her breath. The neighbor crossed the room and knelt in front of her. "You did the right thing," she said, voice tight. The girl nodded, but her face was pale. "I didn't feel her stop me," the girl said quietly. The neighbor's throat tightened. "What did you feel?" The girl looked down at her hands. "I felt me," she said. The neighbor blinked, caught off guard. The girl swallowed hard. "I wanted to be brave," she admitted. "I wanted to prove I could." The neighbor reached up and brushed hair from the girl's forehead, gentle. "Being brave isn't taking the shortcut," she said softly. "Being brave is turning around when something feels wrong." The girl stared at her. Then her eyes filled. Not from fear, from release. "I didn't want her to be tired," the girl whispered. The neighbor's chest tightened painfully. "Oh," she said, barely audible. She pulled the girl into a hug. The girl clung to her, shoulders shaking. That night, the girl couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle. The neighbor sat beside her, quiet. After a long time, the girl whispered, "Was she there?" The neighbor took a careful breath. "I think," she said, "she was with you the way she always has been." The girl's voice was small. "Then why didn't she—" "Stop it?" The neighbor stared at the darkness, feeling the weight of that question. Because if the protection was real, then so were its limits. She answered as gently as she could. "Maybe," she said, "because she didn't need to." The girl turned her head. "What do you mean?" The neighbor swallowed. "Because you listened," she said. "You noticed. You chose the safe thing." The girl's eyes glistened. "So, I did it?" The neighbor nodded, tears rising. "Yes," she whispered. "You did it." The room stayed quiet. But the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt present, as if something unseen had stepped back, not out of absence, but out of trust. And for the first time, the girl understood what the protection had been building toward all along. Not a life without danger, a life where she could survive it. After that night, nothing felt the same. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way anyone else would notice. But inside the girl, something settled into place. She didn't replay the moment with the shortcut over and over the way adults replay close calls. She didn't imagine different endings. She accepted it. Not because it hadn't been frightening, it had, but because fear had done its job. It had warned her, and she had listened. The next morning, the girl woke up tired but calm. She moved more slowly than usual, choosing each step as if she were testing the ground beneath her. The neighbor watched her carefully. "Do you want to stay home today?" she asked. The girl shook her head. "No," she said. "I want to go." There was no bravado in her voice, just certainty. At school, her friend clung to her. The other girl was jumpy now, eyes darting at every sound. "Are you scared?" the girl asked her gently. Her friend nodded, embarrassed. "A little." The girl thought about it. "I was too," she said. "But it went away when we ran." Her friend looked at her, confused. "How did you know to stop?" The girl didn't answer right away. She had been thinking about that question all night. "I felt wrong," she said finally. "And I didn't argue with it." Her friend frowned. "I always argue." The girl smiled softly. "So do I," she said. "Sometimes." That day, the teachers noticed something new. The girl wasn't just careful. She was attentive to others. When a classmate tripped, she was the first to kneel beside them. When voices rose during a game, she stepped between children before things escalated. She didn't command. She suggested, "Let's slow down. Maybe not that way. We can wait." And people listened. Not because she was loud, because she was calm. That evening, the neighbor cooked dinner while the girl sat at the table drawing. The drawing wasn't of people. It wasn't of houses or trees. It was of a path. Two paths, actually. One narrow, one wide. The girl had drawn herself standing between them. The neighbor watched quietly. "What are those?" she asked. The girl didn't look up. "Choices," she said. The neighbor nodded. "Do you know which one you'll take?" she asked. The girl smiled faintly. "I think I'll know when I'm there." That night, the neighbor dreamed again. But this time, it wasn't of danger. It was of distance. She stood on one side of a field watching the girl walk ahead. Not running, not hesitating. Walking. Someone else stood beside the neighbor. Not touching, not speaking, just watching too. The neighbor didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. She woke with a strange mix of emotions. Pride, sadness, gratitude. The next few weeks passed, quietly. No close calls, no alarms. Life resumed its ordinary rhythm. And that was when the neighbor realized something important. The protection hadn't disappeared. It had become invisible because it was no longer needed in the same way. Like training wheels taken off a bike. They weren't gone because they failed. They were gone because they worked. One afternoon, the girl came home later than usual. The neighbor felt the old tension rise in her chest, but she didn't panic. She waited. The door opened. "I stopped by the library," the girl said, setting her bag down. "Why didn't you tell me?" the neighbor asked, keeping her tone light. The girl hesitated. "I didn't think I had to," she said. The neighbor studied her face. Not defiance, growth. "Okay," she said. "Next time, just let me know." The girl nodded. "I will." That night, as the girl lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling again. "She doesn't need to work so hard now," she said quietly. The neighbor sat beside her. "Who?" she asked, though her voice was soft. The girl turned her head. "Mom." The neighbor swallowed. "What makes you say that?" The girl thought carefully. "Because I listen," she said, "and because I stop when it matters." The neighbor felt tears gather. "Yes," she whispered. "You do." The girl shifted under the blanket. "Will she ever go away?" she asked. The neighbor took a deep breath. "I don't think love works like that," she said. "I think it changes shape." The girl seemed satisfied. She closed her eyes. Before she fell asleep, she murmured something the neighbor almost missed. "I'll keep it safe," she said. The neighbor leaned closer. "What will you keep safe?" The girl didn't answer. She was already asleep. The neighbor sat there long after, thinking. She realized then that the protection had done more than keep the girl alive. It had taught her how to protect herself. And maybe, someday, others too. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, something quiet and steady held. Not a hand. Not a voice. Just the kind of presence that stays even when it no longer needs to act. The true separation didn't come with a goodbye. It came with a departure that felt normal. Too normal. The girl was older now. Old enough that the word child no longer fit the way it once had. Old enough to want distance not as rebellion, but as direction. She had been accepted into a program across the city, a place with longer days, more responsibility, more independence. The neighbor held the letter in her, hands longer than necessary. She read it twice, then again. She smiled, because that was what she was supposed to do. "I'm proud of you," she said. The girl smiled back. I know. The morning of the first day arrived quietly. No nerves, no tears. The girl packed her bag carefully, checking each pocket like she always did. The neighbor watched from the doorway. She wanted to give advice, to remind her of rules, to say something that mattered. Nothing came, because everything that needed to be said had already been lived. They walked together to the corner. The girl stopped. You don't have to come farther, she said. The neighbor nodded. I know. They stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then the girl turned and walked away. She didn't look back. The neighbor didn't call after her. She waited until the girl disappeared into the crowd before she allowed herself to breathe. The house felt different that day. Not empty. Changed. The neighbor wandered from room to room, noticing small things she had stopped seeing. The stool still locked away, the cabinet latches, the stove knobs she always checked out of habit. She realized how many layers of protection had been built here, and how many were no longer needed. That afternoon, the neighbor received a message. I'm okay. That was all. No details, no reassurance, just a statement. The neighbor smiled. The girl's days grew fuller. She spent more time away, made new friends, navigated new spaces. The near misses didn't stop entirely. They changed. Now danger wasn't falling shelves or open gates. It was decisions, pressure, people, and the girl handled them the same way she always had. She paused. She listened. She chose. One evening, she came home later than expected. The neighbor felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but it passed. The girl walked in, tired but calm. Long day, she said. The neighbor nodded. Do you want dinner? The girl smiled. Yes. They ate quietly. Afterward, the girl lingered in the kitchen. She touched the counter absently. Do you remember the stove? She asked suddenly. The neighbor froze. Yes, she said. The girl nodded. I do too. There was no fear in her voice, only memory. I think that was the first time, the girl said. The first time I learned to stop. The neighbor swallowed. It was, she said. The girl leaned back against the counter. She didn't stop me, she said. She helped me stop myself. The neighbor felt something loosen in her chest. That night, the neighbor dreamed one last time. She stood in the kitchen again. The stove was off. The room was bright. The girl stood beside her, older, steady. Someone stood farther back now. Not close, not watching intently, just present. The neighbor turned her head slightly. For the first time, she felt no need to look. When she woke, the house was quiet, peaceful. The girl left early the next morning, a note on the table. Back later. The neighbor smiled at it. She realized then that this was the separation, not absence, independence. Protection had done what it was meant to do. It had kept the story going. That afternoon, the neighbor went through the house and made changes. She removed the cabinet locks, put the stool back in the bathroom, stopped double-checking the stove, not because danger was gone, because trust had replaced fear. That night, when the girl returned, she noticed. You changed things, she said. The neighbor nodded. You don't need them anymore. The girl studied the room. No, she said. I don't. She paused. But thank you for keeping them when I did. The neighbor's eyes filled. You're welcome. Later, as the girl lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling one last time. She's farther now, she said quietly. The neighbor sat beside her. Does that feel scary? She asked. The girl shook her head. No, she said. It feels right. The neighbor exhaled slowly. Yes, she whispered. It does. The girl turned onto her side. Before sleep claimed Her, she said something that closed the circle. She doesn't have to watch so closely anymore. The neighbor nodded. She taught you how. The room fell quiet, not empty, complete. Understanding didn't arrive as a revelation. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense, no single sentence that tied all the threads together. It arrived slowly, quietly, in hindsight. The girl began to notice it in the absence. Not the absence of danger that never truly goes away, but the absence of that familiar internal pressure she had lived with for as long as she could remember. The feeling that used to rise in her chest at certain moments. The heaviness, the pause, the instinct to stop. It still came sometimes, but not always, and that was new. At first, she wondered if something was wrong. Had she lost it? Had she stopped listening well enough? She didn't tell the neighbor about these thoughts. Some questions felt too personal, too close to the center of who she was becoming. Instead, she observed. She paid attention to herself the way she had learned to pay attention to the world. She noticed that when the feeling didn't come, it wasn't because danger was present and ignored. It was because she already knew what to do. She didn't need the warning anymore. One evening, she stood alone in the kitchen, the same kitchen where it had all begun. The stove was off, cold, silent. She rested her hand on the counter and closed her eyes. For a moment, she tried to remember exactly what it had felt like that first time. The glow, the warmth, the moment her body had stopped before her mind understood why. She realized something then that made her throat tighten. That moment had never been about the stove. It had been about choice. The neighbor noticed the change too, not in anything dramatic, in the way the girl moved through the house without hesitation, in the way she made plans without checking first, in the way she trusted herself. One night, the neighbor asked, gently, "Do you ever feel like you're missing something?" The girl considered the question carefully. "No," she said. "I feel like I'm carrying it." The neighbor didn't ask what. She already knew. Days passed, weeks. Life continued in its ordinary rhythm. School, responsibilities, quiet dinners, conversations that drifted between serious and trivial. And in that normalcy, something profound settled into place. The girl wasn't being protected anymore. She was being trusted, not just by the neighbor, by the presence that had once intervened so carefully, so precisely, so tirelessly. That realization came one afternoon in the most unremarkable way possible. The girl was walking home alone when she noticed something off. A car parked too long, an engine still running, a man inside watching the street instead of the road. The old version of her would have felt the pressure, the warning, the need to stop. This time she didn't. Instead, she adjusted. She crossed the street early. She entered a busy store. She waited. The car drove away minutes later. Nothing happened. And yet, everything had. That night she sat on her bed, staring at her hands. "I didn't feel her," she said quietly when the neighbor came in. The neighbor sat beside her. "How did that feel?" she asked. The girl searched for the words. "Strong," she said. "But also alone." The neighbor nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "Those two things often arrive together." The girl frowned. "Is that bad?" The neighbor shook her head. "No," she said softly. "It means you're standing on your own feet." The girl looked down. "I don't want her to disappear." The neighbor reached for her hand. "I don't think she will," she said. "I think she just doesn't need to stand between you and the world anymore." That night, the girl dreamed. Not of danger, not of intervention. She dreamed she was walking through a wide open space. No obstacles, no warnings. Someone walked beside her for a while, not holding her hand, not guiding her. just matching her pace. Then, slowly, without drama, they fell a step behind. The girl kept walking. When she woke, her chest felt light. The next morning, she noticed something small but significant. She made a mistake, a real one. She forgot an important assignment, missed a deadline. There was no pause, no redirection, just consequence. She felt embarrassed, disappointed. She fixed it, learned, and realized something that made her smile despite herself. This was also protection, not from harm, from helplessness. The neighbor watched her handle it with quiet pride. "You didn't ask for help," she said later. The girl shrugged. "I knew what to do." The neighbor nodded. That was it. That was the difference. The protection had never been about stopping every fall. It had been about ensuring she would always be able to stand back up. One evening, the girl finally said the thing she had been circling for days. "She's tired," she said softly. The neighbor didn't flinch. "She's been watching for a long time." The girl nodded. "She deserves to rest." The neighbor felt tears sting her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "She does." That night, the girl stood in the kitchen once more. She turned off the light. The room fell into darkness. Nothing stirred. Nothing needed to. She whispered, not in fear, not in need, but in gratitude. "I'm okay?" The silence that followed felt different than it ever had before. Not attentive, not strained, peaceful, as if something unseen had finally exhaled. The understanding didn't come all at once. It arrived in layers, unfolding slowly as the girl continued to live her life without noticing that something fundamental had already changed. She stopped checking the air before stepping forward, stopped scanning rooms automatically, stopped bracing for interruption, not because the world had become safe, but because she had become capable. At first, the absence felt strange, like silence after a long, steady noise you didn't realize you were listening to every day. She caught herself waiting for that familiar internal signal, the pause, the wait, the unmistakable sense of not this. Sometimes it came. Often, it didn't. And when it didn't, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. She was attentive. That difference mattered. One afternoon, the girl stood at the edge of a busy intersection, watching people move through it without thinking. Phones in hands, eyes elsewhere. Momentum doing most of the work. She waited. Not because something felt wrong, because she had learned that waiting was sometimes the most powerful action. She crossed when it made sense, when the rhythm aligned. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. That evening, she sat with the neighbor on the couch, the television on, but unwatched. "Do you ever miss her?" the girl asked suddenly. The neighbor didn't answer right away. "Yes," she said finally, "but not the way people think." The girl tilted her head. "How?" "I miss who I was when I was protecting you," the neighbor admitted. "I miss knowing exactly what my role was." The girl considered that. "I think she felt like that too," she said softly. The neighbor's chest tightened. "What makes you think that?" The girl shrugged. She liked knowing when to step in. Silence filled the room. Not heavy, not awkward, honest. Later that night, the girl sat alone at her desk, writing in a notebook she had kept hidden for years. Not a diary, a record. Moments, choices. Times she had stopped. Times she hadn't. She realized something unsettling and freeing at the same time. There were fewer entries now, not because nothing happened, but because she didn't need to mark them anymore. The moments weren't milestones, they were habits. The neighbor noticed the notebook a few days later. "You don't write as much," she said gently. The girl smiled. "I don't need to," she replied. That answer stayed with the neighbor. Protection had turned into instinct. Instinct had turned into judgment. And judgment was quietly becoming wisdom. The girl began to notice something else too. Other people. The way they rushed. The way they ignored discomfort. The way they overrode small warnings because they were inconvenient. She didn't lecture. She didn't correct. She adjusted herself instead. She chose different seats, different routes, different timing, and sometimes, when it mattered, she spoke. Let's wait. Maybe not here. Something feels off. Not everyone listened, but some did. And those moments echoed something deep inside her, a sense of continuity, of something passed forward without words. One evening, walking home as the sun dipped low, she felt it again. The pressure, faint, distant, not a command, a reminder. She stopped walking and looked around. Nothing obvious, no threat, no urgency, just a feeling that she should slow down. So she did. Moments later, a cyclist sped past the corner too fast, nearly colliding with a pedestrian. The girl watched it happen, heart steady. She hadn't been saved. She had simply been prepared. That night, she told the neighbor. I felt it today, she said quietly. The neighbor looked up from the sink. And? It was different, the girl said. Like a whisper instead of a hand. The neighbor nodded slowly. Yes, she said. That's how it fades. The girl frowned. Fades. The neighbor turned off the water and dried her hands. Not disappears, she clarified. Transforms. The girl absorbed that. Later, lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling again. Something she hadn't done in a long time. She doesn't need to do it anymore, she said softly. The neighbor sat beside her. No, she agreed. She doesn't. Is she still here? The girl asked. The neighbor thought carefully. I think, she said, that she's where she always was. The girl closed her eyes. That answer felt right. Days passed, then weeks. The girl grew busier, more independent, more herself. And with that growth came a realization that landed slowly but deeply. She wasn't carrying protection anymore. She was carrying responsibility for herself, for her choices, for the moments when stopping mattered. One evening, the neighbor watched her from the kitchen doorway as the girl packed a bag for a weekend trip with friends. You don't seem nervous, the neighbor observed. The girl smiled. I know how to listen, she said. The neighbor's eyes filled. Yes, she whispered. You do. That night, the neighbor stood alone in the kitchen. She looked at the stove, the counter, the place where it had all begun. She realized something that brought a quiet ache to her chest. The protection hadn't been extraordinary. It had been precise. It hadn't changed the world. It had changed timing. And timing, she understood now, was everything. She turned off the light and stood in the darkness for a moment longer than necessary. I think she's okay, she said softly. The silence that followed felt complete, not watchful, not waiting, at rest. The next morning, the girl left early. She hugged the neighbor quickly before stepping out. I'll be back later, she said. The neighbor nodded. I know. The door closed. The neighbor didn't feel the old tightness in her chest. She felt trust. Across the city, the girl walked with confidence. She noticed things. She chose well. And in moments when something felt slightly wrong, she didn't panic. She paused. She adjusted. She moved forward. She didn't know exactly when the protection had stepped fully back. She only knew that it had done what it was meant to do. It had kept her alive long enough to learn how to live. And somewhere, beyond fear and effort and vigilance, something finally rested. The final realization didn't arrive as a moment of triumph. There was no swelling music, no sense of victory. It arrived as peace, the kind that settles in quietly, almost unnoticed, when something that has been holding tension for a very long time finally lets go. The girl was older, now. Old enough that her childhood no longer defined her, but close enough that its echoes still shaped how she moved through the world. She didn't think about protection the way she once had, didn't name it, didn't look for it. She lived. And living, she had learned, was the truest test of whether something had worked. One evening, she found herself alone in the kitchen again. Not the same kitchen, different place, different city, but the same ordinary quiet. She stood by the counter, watching, water heat on the stove, waiting, patient, present. The burner glowed softly. She adjusted it without thinking, turned it down, checked the handle, stepped back, not because of fear, because of habit. Good ones. She smiled to herself, just slightly. It occurred to her then that she hadn't thought about that first moment in a long time. The stove, the pause, the almost, not because it had faded, because it had fulfilled its purpose. Later that night, she sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand, scrolling through messages. One from the neighbor stood out. "How was your day?" the girl typed back. "Good. Nothing bad happened." She paused, then added, "And if it did, I handled it." The reply came quickly. "I know you did." The girl set the phone aside and lay back, staring at the ceiling. She thought about all the times she had been stopped, all the times something had intervened before she understood why. And she finally understood what those moments had been shaping her toward. Not safety, capability. Protection hadn't been a shield. It had been a lesson, a slow, careful education in how to notice the world without being consumed by it, how to trust discomfort, how to pause without freezing, how to choose differently. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel watched. She felt trusted. Across the city, in a smaller apartment filled with familiar echoes, the neighbor sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quieter now. No footsteps, no small questions, no constant awareness humming beneath every thought. She had expected emptiness. Instead, she felt completion. She stood and walked to the stove. Old habit. She checked the knobs, then stopped herself. She laughed softly. "You don't have to do that anymore," she said aloud. The room stayed silent, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like rest. She thought back to that first night, the heat, the timing, the impossibility of it. She realized something that hadn't fully formed until now. Protection had never been about control. It had been about continuity, about making sure the story didn't end before it had a chance to become itself. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat back down. She whispered something she hadn't said before. "You did enough." The words felt right. Wherever love goes when it's done its work, she hoped it was there now, at ease, at peace. The girl dreamed that night, not of danger, not of warning. She dreamed of walking through a wide, open space. The ground was solid, the air clear. Someone walked beside her for a while, not guiding, not stopping her, just matching her pace. Eventually, without drama or sadness, they slowed. The girl kept going. She didn't look back. When she woke, the feeling stayed with her. Lightness. Later that week, the girl found herself in a small situation that once would have frozen her. A wrong turn, an unfamiliar street, a moment of uncertainty. She stopped. She breathed. She assessed. She chose. She reached her destination safely. No intervention, no whisper, no hand. Just her. And that was the moment she understood fully. Protection doesn't disappear. It transforms into who you become. It becomes the pause before a step, the decision to wait, the courage to turn around, the strength to say no, the wisdom to say yes. The story had never been about a mother who stayed behind. It had been about a mother who taught her child how to walk forward. And when that lesson was learned, she no longer needed to stand in the way. She could rest. Because the girl was ready, because the girl was alive, because the girl knew how to protect herself, and because love, when it's done right, doesn't cling, it prepares. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, reflect, or see protection and love a little differently, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this don't shout, they don't rush, they wait for the people who need them. And if you're here, maybe this one was meant for you. Thank you for being part of this story.